In the last lesson, we looked more broadly at definitions of critical and creative thinking and began to think about how they might be applied to your classroom and curriculum.
In this lesson, you'll be given an opportunity to think more explicitly about how these could be used in your classroom and with your content. We'll be applying the concepts and ideas from lesson 1 and 2. First, we'll look at the student learning outcomes and write self-reflective prompts specific to your discipline and aligned with each outcome.
There are two resources available to help you through the exercises outlined in this lecture. The first is an interactive PDF that's posted on our course space, and the second is a digital worksheet that you can copy and fill out outlining the critical and creative thinking process using language and ideas specific to your discipline.
Based on the definitions of critical and creative thinking introduced to you in the last lesson and their corresponding intellectual standards, the Think program at NC State drafted this diagram that walks through the discrete steps of the process and integrates self-reflective processes that can and should be happening throughout. Discrete steps include raising questions and formulating problems, gathering and assessing relevant information, synthesizing and generating ideas, considering alternatives, reaching reasoned conclusions, and effectively communicating. And throughout each of these stages are opportunities for students to ask problem-based questions, question their personal assumptions, seek and generate alternative questions and answers, and reflect on how they're thinking and learning.
Now let's take a look at some of the reflective questions that might go along with each of these discrete processes. There are more in the interactive PDF, and many of these questions can be appropriate at more than one stage. In raising questions and formulating problems, you might encourage students to ask, is this an important problem to consider? Is the idea original? What are some of the complexities? In gathering and assessing relevant information, it might be important for students to consider, is the information relevant? Was the issue looked at from multiple perspectives? Is the information clear and accurate? When synthesizing and generating ideas, you might ask, are my ideas novel and diverse? Am I limiting possible divergent ideas because of my assumptions or biases? In considering alternatives, are the alternatives adaptable to different contexts? Do I need to consider another point of view? When encouraging reflecting on reaching reasoned conclusions, you might ask, are my conclusions biased? If so, how do I minimize this bias? Does this conclusion logically follow from the evidence? And finally, in effectively communicating, you might encourage students to ask themselves, am I clear, accurate, and precise? Have I made the information relevant to my audience's needs and expectations?
Step 1 will be to rewrite the steps of the critical and creative process using language and concepts that are unique and most relevant in your field and curriculum. What does the critical and creative thinking process look like in your discipline or classroom? What is the language that you would use? What are the unique and discrete steps your students need to take? We'll walk through a few examples. You may use the interactive PDF and the Moodle resources to review the Think language and especially to see a few more of the questions that might be asked within each of these stages. Now we want you to think about how some of this language translates and connects to your curriculum and field. Let's take a closer look at an example from a field like design and how these stages might be written a little differently. In raising questions and formulating problems, we might write it more like identify, analyze, and frame the wicked problem and its roots. The reflective questions that we might ask in design related to this first step could be to help students think more deeply or broadly about the problem, to find more novel ways to look at it, to use intellectual standards to help them assess their judgments, biases, and generally reflect on their own thinking throughout the stage of the process. So in design, those questions might be geared towards trying to better understand the scope of the problem and the many subproblems that a wicked problem has. It might also encourage students to reflect, even in these early stage, on what other problems might arise as a result of solving one of the identified problems. So questions might be, how is the problem currently defined? What are the components or subproblems of the wicked problem as currently understood? What other problems might arise from solving this problem? And have I looked at this problem from various angles? Gathering and assessing relevant information might be written more like gather information to more fully empathize with the user. And then reflection questions that align with this could be, what are the user needs and wants? What is their frame of reference? How has past experience shaped current understanding? What are the different points of view? And even, what are my assumptions about the user and product? And we can look at the full cycle here and see how each section is related to the original. Some of your language might be very similar to the existing, and others might diverge more. The purpose is to make this process meaningful and helpful to you. Let's take another brief look at an example from the humanities to see how it's similar and different. Again, raising questions and formulating problems. In the humanities, raising questions and formulating problems might be written: examine primary texts, images, films, and theory, and formulate a question in order to foreground archival research. And then related questions and reflective questions might be, what questions arise from the text? What specifically elicits these questions or key notions? What are the relations between the key notions, texts, and forms? And which question is most significant and relevant to the call for proposals, conferences, courses, interests, etc.? And then we can see here how some of this language translates throughout the full process. And finally, in STEM, and the physical sciences more specifically, raising questions and formulating problems might be written as make observation, which then could have the associated reflection questions like, what do I see in nature or the real world? Where did it come from? What are the patterns? How have my own experiences shaped my observation? Is this a novel, significant, and relevant observation? And here we see the entire process and associated questions. Feel free to pause the presentation here to take a deeper look or to keep any of these examples up while you are doing the next part of this exercise.